Excellent. Well, you know who I am. So, part of the benefit of having a small group, I hope, is that it would be great to get some really good feedback on what works, what doesn't work, what's too repetitive, so that when we give it again, perhaps to a larger group, that we're in a better position to be able to make it more targeted and more focused and benefit people. So please keep that in mind as we go through it and let me know at the end, what we do. I will stop after we deal with faith and have time for questions, and then we'll do reason and then have another time for questions and then finish with doubt and then head off to the kitchen. So Christian faith is trust, whether that's trust in ourselves or trust in others or trust in things or trust in God. In World War II, a group of Jews in Eastern Europe hid from the Nazis in a forest and chose a leader. They established a community with a school and a clinic and warm shelters to survive the freezing winter. But as winter began to turn to spring, the Nazis found their hiding place and planned to capture them. As Jews heard the vehicles approach, their leader gathered the men, children and women and fled off through the winter snow. They soon came to a river covered with ice and stopped, wondering if the ice would support their weight. One of the men used an axe to chop a hole in the ice and found that it was several inches thick. "I think the ice is strong enough," he said, "but it's likely to be thinner in the middle. But if it breaks, we'll all die," said another. The leader hesitated. If he leads these people across the ice, it might collapse, and they would all die horribly in the freezing water swept under the ice. So he looked at the fearful faces of the elderly and the women and children, and he thought it's possible they might be able to escape if they ran further down the riverbank, but it was pretty unlikely. But they're certain that the Nazis can't drive their vehicles across the river because the ice would collapse. So, if they did manage to cross safely, they would certainly escape. But he's uncertain about the thickness of the ice in the middle of the river. What should he do? He could say the ice is strong enough and hope everyone else goes first. But he can't do that. He must lead by demonstration, by action. And he can't claim to believe in the ice without stepping on the ice, not without walking across and calling out, "Follow me." So he steps on the ice and some begin anxiously following him. But some people doubt. Is he leading them to their deaths? Maybe they should take their chances with the Nazis. Perhaps they won't kill everyone. Maybe I can survive, thinks one. But as their leader approaches the river's centre, there's a cracking sound, and he sees the ice crack and creak under his feet. Now he's filled with doubt again, and he calls out to stop. He takes another step, and the ice holds. He makes his way carefully, step by step, across the ice until he's on thick ice again on the other side. Then he calls out to the others to follow in single file, one at a time. They follow him, and eventually they all safely cross to the other side. So this story is like faith described in the Bible, because biblical faith is like the river crossing. Crossing the river is like our life. It's an existential crisis. We must choose. We have knowledge about the ice, and we can use our reason to decide whether we think the ice will hold our weight. But we're never 100% certain. There's uncertainty. And with uncertainty, there's also doubt. This is like faith in God. We have knowledge about God, and God is represented by the thickness of the ice on the river. If we tell everyone, "I believe this ice is thick enough," but don't step on it ourselves, then this suggests we don't really have faith in the ice. And that's like knowing God, but living as if God doesn't exist. Stepping on the ice is real faith. It's choosing to take action, knowing that the uncertainty and the doubt that's always there, but believing that this is the right action to take. When we step on the ice, we're engaging in the type of faith described in the Bible, for God is the ice supporting us through our life. So Christian faith or biblical faith is not blind faith. Blind faith would have us running across the ice without checking first whether it will hold our weight, without thinking about it or considering anything else. Having put our faith in the ice, though, we now walk across. But when cracks appear, we discover new information, causing us to suddenly doubt. Is the ice still strong enough? In this case, it's actually wise to doubt. If they walked blindly across the ice, they might have died. The weak ice in the middle is like new knowledge, and it's wise to adapt our actions to new knowledge. It means our previous knowledge was too simple for the complexity of the world we live in. By refining the way they walk across the ice with the new knowledge, they continue to trust and successfully cross the river and escape. We get our English word faith from the Latin word fidem, meaning trust. It's also where we get fidelity, meaning our promise can be trusted. To have faith in someone or something means we trust that someone or something. But biblical faith is more than just intellectual belief. It's also trust demonstrated by action. And since words can have different meanings depending on who we're talking to and the context, to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to words, we need to be clear on what Christians mean by belief and knowledge and truth. So sometimes our action taken in faith is an intellectual action, such as belief. And belief is intellectually thinking something is true. It's not the same as faith. When we believe something to be true, we are saying that it represents the objective reality that is there. So if I tell you Daniel drives a red car, then I'm saying the redness of his car is objective reality. If you have faith in me or you trust me because you think I'm competent to identify colours and I'm a trustworthy person, then you have a strong enough foundation to support your belief that Daniel's car is red. Now, when you see Daniel driving his car, you expect it will be a red car. So belief is an intellectual action based on faith in someone or something and a well-reasoned argument. It's helpful to think of belief and knowledge as the roof of a house held up by the walls of faith on a foundation of sound reasons. For example, if I believe that 2 + 2 = 4, then I have faith in mathematics as a tool that works. I also have faith in myself that I'm a competent user of mathematics. That is, I can add 2 + 2 and get 4. If I'm in school doing a test, then with faith in my abilities, I take action by writing the answer 4 on my test paper. If we live in a house of beliefs that are true, we can live protected under its roof and be more resilient when the storms of life batter us. So we need to distinguish between two ways that we use the word believe in, or the phrase believe in. When we say we believe in God, this can mean we believe God exists, that in a metaphysical sense, God is there as an objective reality. But we also say believe in God to mean that we trust God and his promises, and that impacts the way we live our lives. When we use believe in God in this way, what we're really saying is that we have faith in God in the same way we might believe in our favourite football player, that he will kick enough goals to win the game. So knowledge and truth are different things. Truth is objective and external to us. It doesn't depend on someone knowing it to be true. For example, 2 + 3 = 5 is true, was true before any humans existed. Who could know that? Knowledge is truth that we acquire for ourselves. It's internal. Our knowledge may be false, and it's always an approximation to the truth. But Christians believe that God is truth, which explains why truth is objective and rational and always there, even if we don't know it or even believe it. People will use the word faith to mean different things, so let's look at some of those. In Through the Looking Glass, Alice complains that one can't believe impossible things, to which the Red Queen replies, I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I did it for half an hour a day. By sometimes, I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Alice in Wonderland faith is believing in impossible things or nonsense, like 2 + 2 = 5. And God does not ask us to believe such things. It isn't biblical, nor is it consistent with God's character as a rational person, who created us as rational creatures in his image, in a rational universe that we can understand. We don't live in Alice's Wonderland or in a looking glass world. The next one, blind faith. When the new atheist told everyone it was ridiculous to believe with faith, they didn't appear to understand that what they were talking about was blind faith, not Christian faith. For blind faith is the ability to believe something to be true when there's no evidence or good reason to do so. It's belief just because. Blind faith would mean running across the ice without checking first whether it would hold our weight. Now, it's true that the concept of faith in other religions is probably often blind faith. And unfortunately, many Christians' concept of faith is also blind faith. But this is not the faith described in the Bible. In the Bible, God calls people to faith based on evidence and reasoned argument. Christian faith is not blind. Biblical faith is evidence-based. In Deuteronomy 7, Moses reminds the Israelites to be faithful to God and not to be afraid. Why? He says, "You shall remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and all Egypt, the great trials your eyes saw, the wonders, the mighty hand of God." In other words, he's pointing out that the evidence that you saw with your own eyes, the words you heard spoken from the mountain. And in Luke, in the New Testament, Luke writes that after taking the testimony of those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. In Matthew 11, John the Baptist doubted whether Jesus was the Messiah. So he sent word and asked, "Are you the one who is to come, or do we look for another?" Jesus responded to tell John of the evidence of what you see and hear. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up. In other words, Jesus is engaging in a well-reasoned argument. He claims that he's the Messiah, and lays out the supporting evidence for his claim you can see with your own eyes. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul presents evidence of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection when he writes, then he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. In other words, there are people you can talk to who will verify the evidence that I'm giving you. In 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter says, "For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." And he goes on to say that, referring to the transfiguration, "We ourselves heard this very voice from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain." In other words, we saw compelling evidence with our own eyes, we heard the voice with our own ears, and we're not asking you to believe myths, things that are not true. So faith is demonstrated by action. In James, he argues that if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and if one of you says to him, "Go in peace, be warm and filled," without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? In other words, step on the ice. Demonstrate your faith with action. "I will show you my faith by my works," says James. When Jordan Peterson was asked a few years ago if he believed in God, he said, "I live as if God exists," which is the same thing as belief for me. Whether or not he really believes in God is beside the point, I think. What he said is really a true statement of biblical faith. For biblical faith is more than an intellectual position. It's an action that demands commitment. And since Christian faith is action based on a reasoned argument, Christian faith is also a rational faith. It makes sense to believe in God. It makes sense to believe that Jesus rose from the dead because there are good reasons supporting that belief. Now, the Bible does give us many stories of faithful people struggling through the storms of life when the evidence seems contrary to God's promise. In Hebrews 11:1, which contains perhaps the most well-known verse describing faith, it says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." As with every verse in the Bible, it needs to be understood in the context of the previous verses in chapter 10. Hebrews is actually encouraging suffering Christians to endure patiently, to be faithful to God, to one day receive the promise of an abiding future in God's presence. So you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and not delay. So the letter to the Hebrews then engages in a reasoned argument by reminding us that despite hard times, we can be assured of our hope of a better future in eternity with God. And to provide evidence to support this argument, he reminds us about how those in the past were faithful through dark times and received the promise of God: Abel, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, and others. But then he further argues that even when they didn't receive the promise in their lifetime, they saw it from afar and stayed faithful, believing that God would deliver on his promises. We hear how they were stoned, sawn in two, killed with the sword, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, wandering in deserts, in dens and caves of the earth, and remained faithful though they did not receive the promise in their lifetime. So the writer of the Hebrews is providing his readers with a compelling argument and supporting evidence. He's not calling them to blind faith. God had spoken, and they thought trusting the creator of the universe and his promises was a safe bet. Another person who wrote with compelling argument and supporting evidence was Sir Isaac Newton. We have the Great Plague of London to thank for the great leap forward in science, because to avoid the plague, Newton left London and spent time in the countryside thinking about gravity. Newton was an early pioneer of what we would call today the scientific method, which includes direct observation, experimentation, and other rational thinking, reasoning. Many people now think of science or the scientific method as reason. So reason is essentially rational or logical thinking to argue a case, either to ourselves or to others. Mathematics, like arithmetic and algebra that we learn in school, or a computer, are just tools in order to reason properly. And mathematics was one tool that Isaac Newton used to develop his theory of gravity. Newton was a Christian who believed that since God is a rational person, then we expect God's creation to work in a rational way and could be understood by rationally thinking people. And because Newton was a Christian, he believed that because we're made in the image of God, we can use our God-given reasoning skills to understand the universe. So this argument became the basis for philosophy of science. And so when we read in the Psalms, the heavens declare the glory of God, this is a poetic statement of philosophy of science. The story goes that one day Newton sat under an apple tree and he saw an apple fall. He reasoned that the force that made the apple to fall was the same force that kept the moon rotating around the earth. Using maths to describe the force led him to his law that a force N applied to a body of mass M will cause it to move with an acceleration A, or F equals m times A. Newton's discovery and his demonstration that the tool of mathematics can describe such physical phenomena opened up new possibilities for scientists. But it also opened the door for the Enlightenment belief that we could use reason alone to discover all truth, including moral values, and that not only is faith unnecessary, but belief in God, is also unnecessary. But as we've seen, faith and reason are conjoined twins. They're joined at the hip. One cannot live without the other. Without a foundation of reason and evidence, our walls of faith can't stand up long, and our faith roof of belief collapses. But if we have a foundation and don't put up walls of faith, we can't support our roof of belief either. Without a roof of belief in truth, our lives are exposed to every wind and storm that comes our way. In a Christian worldview, rational thinking is valuable because rationality is an important attribute of God, and because God does not act irrationally or with caprice. Rational thinking, or the ability to reason, is a gift of God, and a result of our being made in God's image. Christians should seek to imitate God and be skilled users of rational thinking or reason and be reasonable people. God doesn't expect us to check out our brains at the church door. But as fallen human beings, we have to recognise that our reason is fallible, that we can often act irrationally or use reason poorly. We can be unreasonable. We can use reason deceitfully to lie to ourselves and to deceive others. So simple reasoning is an argument having premises, logic, and a conclusion. And this is a famous one. Premise A, all men are mortal. Premise B, Socrates is a man. Logic. Socrates is at the intersection of the set of things which are mortal and the set of things which are man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is a form of deductive reasoning. The conclusion is a simple result of applying logic to the premises, in this case the logic rule modus ponens. But if one of our premises is faulty or false, and it turns out Socrates is not a man after all, then the conclusion may also be false. And if our logic is faulty, we have muddled thinking, which we're prone to at times, then the conclusion may also be false. However, if our premises are true and the logic is correct, then we can trust that the conclusion will also be true. But this means we have to believe the premises in order to believe the conclusion. Since reason is limited by the truth or error of the premises, we need faith in order to reason properly. For example, we must agree that Socrates is a man is a true statement. We must also have faith that we've correctly acquired knowledge of the premises and that our sources of knowledge are reliable. But we also need to have faith in ourselves to perform the logic correctly. We must have that we're rational creatures, that we're acting today in a rational manner, and that our minds are reliable. Because we have to believe that the premises before we can know the conclusion, we're left with a chicken and egg situation, for we have to believe something in order to know anything. This is what Augustine was getting at when he said, I believe, therefore I know. For he's pointing out that we can't start with ourselves and reason alone and come to knowledge. Since Augustine's time, as some of you may know, many have tried, but have failed to do so. So inductive reasoning is based on the probability that something is true. For example, all swans we have ever seen are white. Therefore, all swans are white. There is a high probability if you next see a swan, it will be white. This bird is a swan, therefore this bird is white. The problem with this argument is that to be certain that all swans are white, we have to have seen all swans in the universe, both past, present, and future. This is not possible for finite people whose knowledge is limited, so there's always a measure of uncertainty using inductive reasoning. And as Shakespeare says, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. As we know, when Europeans first arrived in Australia, they stumbled on black swans. Thus, the belief that all swans are white is not true, because now we have observed black swans. I like the idea that Australia upset the apple cart with that. So inductive reasoning, its problem is that we're trying to create a universal that applies to all swans everywhere from the particulars, that is a limited set of swans that we've been able to see. If we could survey the entire 100% field of knowledge, we could be 100% certain in the conclusion. However, only God can see everything and know everything. Therefore, we need faith in our ability to survey enough of the field of knowledge in order to be certain. Again, our belief or knowledge is built on a foundation of faith as well as reason. Scientific laws, like Newton's laws of motion, are built on inductive reasoning. Newton observed that F equals ma was true everywhere he saw on Earth, and also in space with the moon and planets. So he described it as a law. However, 300 years later, Einstein, with his theory of relativity, demonstrated that Newton's law Fm equals ma is not true when speeds approach the speed of light. Newton's law is an approximation that works at low speed, but not of light or black holes. Einstein's theory of relativity, including E equals mc squared, is more accurate. It's more complete knowledge. I'm sure further study of quantum mechanics and black holes might improve our knowledge of space-time continuum and how it works beyond Einstein. One morning, a Melbourne shopkeeper opened his front door and walked to his office at the back, where he found the safe open and all the cash gone, so he immediately rang the police. The forensic science team began dusting for fingerprints on the safe door handle, and later analysis showed that one print belonged to the shopkeeper's brother, Peter, who doesn't work at the shop. When the detective asked the question, what might have caused Peter's fingerprint to appear on the safe door handle, he or she is using abductive logic to help solve the crime. Abductive reasoning, we ask the question, what could have caused the phenomenon that we observe here? One possible cause is that Peter turned the handle to open the safe and stole the money. But there are other causes. For example, it's possible Peter has been framed for the crime. Peter's fingerprint could have been lifted from somewhere else, say a drinking glass, onto a piece of tape, and then transferred to the door handle by someone else. I'm sure we can think of other causes. Aliens may have come. Peter and the shopkeeper might turn out to be identical twins with identical fingerprints. Or Peter might have decided to clean the shop over the weekend to do his brother a favour and not tell him, because it would be a nice surprise. They're all possible reasons. Some are more likely than others. So with our two causes that we've got, Peter's a thief or Peter is being framed, we have to ask the question, which is more likely? We would have to employ some deductive or inductive logic to determine on balance of probability or inference to the best explanation if it's more reasonable to believe Peter was framed or that he actually stole the money. So many arguments for the existence of God actually use abductive reasoning. For example, we can look at the human body and say, well, it looks like it was designed. So what might have caused it to be designed? One possibility is there is a designer who designed it. Another possibility is that it's entirely an accidental collision of atoms. Christians argue that a designer is a more reasonable cause than an accident. Similarly, our DNA contains 3 billion letters or bits of complex functionally specific information necessary to build a human cell. The only known cause of functionally specific information is a mind or an intelligent agent. Christians argue that intelligent agent is God. Others say it could come about by some freak accident, like a bunch of monkeys attempting to type Hamlet by randomly tapping keys on a typewriter. However, no one has known a freak accident to develop any functionally specific information, and monkeys presented with typewriters never get close to typing a single coherent word, let alone typing Hamlet or getting 3 billion keystrokes in the right order. So we ask which cause is more reasonable or more probable, intelligent agent or freak accident. In order to use abductive reasoning, though, we must have faith in our ability to know all the possible causes of a phenomenon. And to be certain, we must cover the entire field of possibilities. But as finite creatures, we can never be certain that we do know all the possible causes. Only God has that level of knowledge. And because, as Shakespeare wrote, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. So we see each method of reasoning requires faith as a necessary partner. And to acquire any knowledge at all demands faith, belief in something as a starting point. Now, at every point in our lives, people will say, I need to know for certain and I want proof. But the uncomfortable reality is that we don't know very much for certain, and very little knowledge can be proven. But it's also true that there are different types of proof and types of certainty. There is mathematical proof, which we love. A plus B equals B plus A. You probably would have done that in year 9 or 10. But these types of proofs apply to abstracted mathematical concepts only. And unfortunately, their applicability to real life is very, very limited. Most of life's decisions and beliefs are made on the balance of probabilities. In a court, the judge or jury decide a verdict based on the probability balance called beyond reasonable doubt. Their decisions are based on faith in the reliability of eyewitness testimonies and the expertise of competent authorities like the forensic science team who dusted for fingerprints. The equivalent process in science is what we would call inference to the best explanation. That means we've come up with a good story, and that's supported by some evidence, and it's the best story we've got so far. Then we have proof by revelation or authority. I'm confident my mechanic is competent, so I follow his advice. My mate Bill told me so, and he's a great bloke who wouldn't lie. None of these sources can be proven at a mathematical level of certainty, but we rely on them day in, day out. Every hour of the day, when we put money in the bank, when we go to a doctor, when we read a newspaper, or we have coffee with our mate Bill. When we ask someone we know and trust for advice, we're often inclined to follow that advice. And trusting in the Bible as God's revelation of knowledge to us is a form of that authority. The uncomfortable reality is that all these forms of proof we use in order to be certain have a measure of uncertainty in them. Here I'm not talking about the level of certainty we accept to live our lives, but the type of philosophical or mathematical certainty often demanded by atheists and other people who find belief in God difficult. Using reason alone, we can't even prove that we exist, that we're not in a dream or in some vast computer simulation like the Matrix. Many have tried and failed to do so. Descartes' dictum, "I think, therefore I am," was his attempt at a starting point of using reason alone to discover truth. Descartes was followed by Hume and many other philosophers since then. Using reason alone, they all failed to develop a coherent system of knowledge they could live with, that is, one that is objectively true. Even mathematical proofs depend on faith in our ability to perform the necessary steps in a logical manner. Since God has created us as finite creatures who are not omniscient, we're faced with the uncomfortable fact that there is no certainty in anything that we do. A measure of trust is absolutely necessary for us to live our lives at even the most basic level. We have faith that the car that drove us here tonight would get us here without breaking down, that our journey would be accident-free, that the fuel gauge is working. But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that God doesn't provide people with visions or personal religious experiences that either turn people to faith in God or confirm their faith in God, which with a sense of certainty that can't be explained rationally or transcends rational arguments. We know God does that because Jesus promised to send the Holy Spirit to guide us into all truth. However, such personal experiences are often only compelling evidence to the person who experienced them. The problem with them is they aren't very transferable. But having believed in God, Christians can be certain God will keep his promises and that his word is true. We can trust that he loves us and is just, that there is ultimate purpose and meaning to our lives, that Christ died and rose again, that his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. These are things Christians can be certain about. Since there's a measure of uncertainty about everything we know, it follows logically that there is an opportunity for a measure of doubt too. Doubt is everyone's problem. In 1990, my wife Heather and I began a 2-year volunteer commitment to teach in a rural high school in Samoa, which is a small Pacific island country. After a passport debacle nearly saw us stranded in Sydney and a long delayed departure, we took an overnight flight and arrived in Samoa hungry and sleep deprived. It was our first experience being overseas. We found ourselves in the least developed country, in the tropics, in peak wet season, which can be unbearable even for locals. Another volunteer met us at the airport and took us to his upstairs flat in our pier, so we could wait until a room became available. The temperature started rising along with the humidity, which is near 100% in wet season Samoa. And after a few hours in the oppressive heat, sweating constantly, hungry, thirsty, and sleep deprived, I realised we were going to spend the next 2 years literally living in a sauna. We were deeply committed. We'd worked towards this for 12 months, leaving our jobs, our families, and our home, in the firm belief that God had led us to Samoa. But I was unsure I'd make it through the first day, let alone 2 years in the place. I seriously wondered if we made a very big mistake. I doubted everything. So doubt is seriously thinking we've taken a wrong turn or believe that something might be false. Doubt undermines our trust in people or things like aeroplanes, and then we become anxious and worried. But even the most faithful of us doubt. In Galatians 2, Paul writes how he went to Jerusalem with Barnabas and Titus to set forth his understanding of the gospel in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. So even the great apostle Paul had doubts and made a special journey to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James to address his doubts. So if a great apostle can doubt, one who is actually a eyewitness to the risen Christ, then doubt is a serious matter for all of us. What I can say with no doubt is that most people find doubt troubling. Doubt can lead to worry, and worry to anxiety, and long-term anxiety can lead to sickness and even death. But we should thank God for doubt, because doubt can also be a very positive thing. If I doubt my car's capability to drive here tonight, I might check the tyres, make sure there's enough petrol or enough water in the radiator. If I doubt the road is clear because of roadworks, I might drive here another way. Doubt enables us to test our beliefs, to put our faith and reason on trial and decide if our reasons are good and we have faith in what's reliable and trustworthy. Without doubt, we can't find false beliefs and discard them. Without doubt, we're not prompted to examine ourselves and evaluate our actions and live better lives. And without doubt, we can become unhealthily secure and confident, leading to pride in ourselves and our knowledge. Without doubt, we become narrow-minded and close the door to further learning, and even try to shut down others who see the world differently. In 1 Corinthians 8, Paul writes, "We know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up. If anyone knows something he does not know, yet know as he ought to know." In his book about doubt, titled Two Minds by Os Guinness, Os points out that doubt helps us realise there is more to knowing than human knowing will ever know. Only God knows everything there is to know, and only God has no doubts. But doubt can be unhealthy too. Unhealthy doubt is often driven by our emotional state, our sinful desires, or unreasonable scepticism. In 1 Kings 19, we read how Elijah, recognised as the greatest prophet in the Old Testament, after having a great triumph and running halfway across Israel, then fled from the Queen Jezebel. He walked for a day into the wilderness and collapsed under a scrubby bush and said to God, "Take my life, for I am no better than my father's." If the greatest prophet can doubt God and themselves and want to end their life when their emotions are at a low ebb, then so can we. We doubt because we're scared. We doubt also because we're worn out and beaten down, like I was in Samoa or like Elijah. We doubt when we hold the hand of a dying loved one in a hospital bed beside a machine. We doubt when our child is born with severe disabilities. We doubt when we see things we gave our lives too broken and battered by the storms of life. And we doubt like Habakkuk when we have to wait patiently for God to answer our prayers. When we realise our doubts are emotionally driven, then we need to take hold of our faith and the commitments we made. Recognise that when we find ourselves in that state, it's not a time to make life-changing decisions. And we need to remind ourselves of the reasons that led us to where we were, where we are, or as in the old Christian song, count our blessings. We might need to thank God for giving us a loved one whose hand we can hold. Sometimes we just have to hold on when there's nothing left in us except the faith and commitment to hold on. Sitting in our friend's flat on that first day in Samoa, I doubted entirely for emotional reasons. Because I was sleep deprived, because I felt terrible, because my emotions were at a low ebb. I didn't doubt because of any sound rational thinking. In fact, I probably wasn't in the emotional state to be able to do sound rational thinking at all. I certainly wasn't in a state to make life-changing decisions, like getting on a plane and flying, going back. But I did have faith in God, that God had sent us to Samoa. I had faith in my wife and friends, that they would support me as I would support them. And I had faith in the assurances of a complete stranger who became a friend, who said, don't worry about it, you get used to it. We can also doubt because of sinful desires, like the manager who wanted to run off with his secretary, but realised that would mean abandoning his entire Christian faith. So he chose to abandon his beliefs and his wife and children and ran off with his secretary. I frequently doubt my dietitian's expertise, particularly when I'm faced with the desire to eat a Portuguese tart for morning tea. Sometimes we doubt because we have enough evidence to believe but act unreasonably. We call this unwarranted skepticism, best illustrated in the Bible by the disciple, doubting Thomas. Thomas heard the eyewitness testimony of the other disciples, who knew very well. The disciples had told him they'd seen the empty tomb and they'd seen the risen Jesus, who had physically met with them. But Thomas was a modern skeptic who said he wouldn't believe unless he could put his finger in the nail holes in Jesus' hand. Of course, when Jesus presented himself to Thomas, he specifically told him to put his fingers in the nail hole. Eyewitness testimony of multiple people and the empty tomb should have been sufficient evidence for Thomas to believe. Academics today who claim that the evidence for Jesus' existence, there is no evidence for Jesus' existence, are engaging in the same type of unwarranted skepticism. Well, there's more evidence for Jesus' existence than for Alexander the Great. Yet no one doubts Alexander was an historical figure. You're not less of a Christian because you doubt, you are just human. And if you think you doubt more than others, that might be because God has given you a more curious mind, a mind that doesn't take things at face value and wants to delve deeper into truth and knowledge. Recognizing that we all doubt, and even the great prophets and apostles in the Bible doubted at times, what should we do? We should wrestle with our doubts and seek to resolve them. Many of you might know John Dickson. He's a well-known Christian apologist, but he calls himself a professional doubter. John says, I've learned over the years not to freak out about my doubts, not to think that they are all disobedience, but to pursue those doubts intellectually and drill down and work out whether the doubts are inspired by some emotional experience, because there is a psychological dimension to doubt and not just an intellectual one. First step when the assault of doubts comes along is to work out what kind of doubt it is and then take appropriate steps. But honesty with yourself is crucial. Many doubts arise because we actually have a faulty picture of God and because our reasons for believing something are weak. We may be like a house with weak foundations. It stays up for a while but falls down when the wind blows. By checking our foundations, we can use doubt to strengthen our beliefs with faith, evidence and sound reasons. While we might feel certain about our basic faith in God, we all have false beliefs. We all believe things for shallow reasons that don't stand up to hard questions. We can use doubt to root out false belief and deepen our knowledge of God and the world He created us and build a strong foundation for faith. When you doubt, check your emotional state. Is now a time to investigate and make a life-changing decision? Perhaps you should wait for a better time or at least get a good night's sleep. Investigate honestly what might be driving your doubt. Is it because of a desire for something or someone or an experience that's sinful? And avoid seeking a level of certainty that's unreasonable or impossible for anybody to have. Recognise that you need more than just a feeling of certainty, because feeling certain is not actual certainty, because when those feelings go away, certainty evaporates with them. And seek help. Talk to other people who've travelled on a similar journey. Many of my early doubts were addressed by talking to older, experienced and wiser Christians who had the same doubts I had when they were younger. And read some good books by people who've delved deep themselves, like many great Christian apologists of the past and present. C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer were people who doubted their atheism to become Christians, but then later doubted different aspects of their Christian faith. By wrestling and addressing their doubts, they were able to share their experience by writing books that have helped millions of people since. And be patient with yourself. Recognise that you're a finite person with finite time, and that you may need to give time for your faith to develop. You might also need more experience, or time studying and digging deep. And while you might be satisfied with your belief in your 20s, recognise that as the storms of life batter you, God may be challenging you to dig a deeper foundation for your faith later on. In his letters to Christians, Jude urges them to have mercy on those who doubt. So if your friend has doubts, don't treat them like someone who's failing or somehow a weaker Christian. Urge them to address their doubts and seek help, and not let doubt eat away at their lives like a corrosive illness. Finally, you must recognise the work of the Holy Spirit in bringing us all to belief. In John 16, Jesus says, when he comes, he will convict the world concerning sin and righteousness. And when the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. All the best reasons in the world cannot bring someone to belief without the work of the Holy Spirit in their life. So if you're a Christian wrestling with doubt, ask the Holy Spirit to make things clear, to bring people into your life, or to guide your study and decision making. So in conclusion, check what you have faith in and the reasons and evidence supporting your faith. Do you trust in the infinite personal God of the universe? If not, what are you trusting in? Faith in God, who created the universe and everything in it, seems like a safe bet. Recognise that reason has a place, but reason alone will not bring us to truth. That God expects us to use our reason, but reason without faith can't help us find truth and knowledge. And when you doubt, wrestle with those doubts and don't shut them down. Recognise that doubt is normal, unavoidable, and can be healthy, but investigate the reasons for your doubt. Are they healthy reasons? Are they good? Or are your doubts driven by fatigue, emotions, or sinful desires? And lastly, recognise the role of the Holy Spirit in helping us and others build belief on a foundation of faith and reason. All the reasons in the world will not convince someone without God doing a work in their lives and bringing them to belief. Before we go to supper and open up the questions at supper, we can all sit around in the kitchen further down there, and there are passes on the stool there that you can pick up and take. I would very much value your feedback and thoughts. But also the next talk will be on June 16th, on a Monday. I've been advised that our pastors that Tuesday is a bad day for them in particular. So we're doing it on a Monday, and there is a flyer on the stool there to take. And we also have here a QR code you can scan and sign up to get with your email address to get future notices. So it'll be back here again on the 16th of June, 7:30 p.m. So decision making in the will of God, mainly because I think this is something that perplexes especially young Christians. We are often told that God has a wonderful plan for our life, but we often wonder why it's so hard to work out what it is. So this is about addressing those conflict and difficulty and helping people through that. So you're all welcome to come.